What is up, everybody, and welcome back to another video. I put every single era in NBA history into one league in 2K24 to answer the very simple question, what is the best era of all time? We're going to go into the league, we're going to simulate 10 seasons, and the era with the most championships at the end of it is going to be the winner. So let's get into it. Alright, so looking at the teams right now, first of all, we have the Boston 60s. You have Bill Russell, Wilt Chamberlain, Oscar Robertson, Jerry West, Bob Cousy, Elgin Baylor, Jerry Lucas, Bob Pettit, George Mikan, and Willis Reed. The reason that I have Bob Pettit and Bob Cousy in here is because I didn't have enough players for the 60s. So we ended up going up one. We have the Philadelphia 70s. This is the guys from the 70s. You guys can read. I'm not going to go through. The 80s, you have obviously the stars of the 80s. 90s is a stacked team. Very stacked team. The Cleveland 2000s are actually going to be in the Western Conference. I accidentally did it. So when I was in the roster creator, I accidentally put too many teams in the Eastern, so we balanced it out. The Warriors now in the East, Cleveland is now in the West, and the Cleveland 2000s are an absolute unstoppable force. The Los Angeles 2010s, what I used to put players on their team is the one where they were the most successful. So even though Shaq was drafted in 92, I put him in the 2000s. Even though LeBron was drafted in 03, he won all of his rings in the 2010s. And then this brings us to our last team, the Memphis 2020s, who might be the worst team at the start. But like you can see on the screen, every single player is 19. We are going to sim 10 seasons. And at the end of the 10 seasons, whoever has the most rings is going to be the one that wins. Everybody else in the league is 40 overall. That is made so these guys get to play each other in the championship every single time. There is no free agency. Everybody's on these teams for life. So there's no free agency. Every single draft is 40 overalls. That's all I have. Let's get into it. I'll sim to the end of this first season. And then we can see who really is the best era. As we get to the end of the season, obviously, we're not going to have any MVPs on any of the teams because they're so stacked. Probably 6th man of the year. Elliot Falls, averaging 43.5 rebounds per game. Good for you. John Havlicek was 6th man of the year for the 70s, which maybe that means the 70s were the #1 team. I have no idea. This man is a monster. Nick Nurse and the 70s went 76-6. He is the coach of the year. Executive of the year was Cody Sampson, which is obviously us with the 2020s. So going into it, the first seed in the West is going to be the 2020s, followed by the third seeded 2010s and the second seeded 2000s. Then you have the 60s, the 80s, the 90s, and the 70s. So actually the 60s are the #1 seed going. What did they go? 76-6. So everybody beat the 73-9 mark over here. And the 2010s ended up just coming short, which is crazy when you just think about it. Simulate the play-in, then simulate to the semifinals where some teams will probably match up. But the 60s, you have Isaiah Thomas against Jerry West, Moncrief against Sam Jones, Elgin Baylor against Larry Bird, Jerry Lucas against Kevin McHale, and Wilt Chamberlain against Moses Malone. I'm going to take the 80s there. You go down to the 70s, and the 70s are going to be playing John Stockton against Walt Frazier, Pete Maravich against Michael Jordan, Scottie Pippen against Julius Erving, Karl Malone, he who shall not be named against Elvin Hayes, and Akeem Olajuwon against Kareem Abdul-Jabbar. By the end of this, everybody's going to be a 9-0, but I don't care because it's fun. Then you go down to here with our next matchup. You have the 2000s against the 2010s, where you have Allen Iverson against Chris Paul, D. Wade against James Harden, Vince Carter against LeBron James, KG against Kawhi, and Shaq against Dwight Howard. Obviously, 2020s are going to win. The 60s are up. We're going to simulate this round. And the 2010s have been beaten by the 2000s. The 70s have been beaten by the 90s. And the 80s have been beaten by the 60s. So the 60s ended up destroying them. Going to the 2020 versus 2000. AI versus Shea. Donovan Mitchell versus D. Wade. Tatum versus Carter. Giannis versus Garnett. And Embiid versus Shaquille O'Neal. So they have Luka coming off the bench. I think the 90s are going to win. So this round, 2020s have been eliminated and the 60s have been eliminated. Which means you have Kevin Garnett against Scottie Pippen. The 2000s against the 90s, where it will end up being the 90s get the first ring of the simulation behind Finals MVP Scottie Pippen. Ring #1 of the first 10 seasons goes to the 90s. All right, so our team we're going to shadow is going to be the 90s as they attempt to repeat. They had a couple close series, but obviously everybody's 19, so no one's going to be retiring. They're beating everyone right now. They just lost to the 60s though, so it's looking like, hey, I just want to see something shake it up a little bit. I'll see you guys at the end of the regular season where we go in to see who gets the ring in the second season of the simulation. All right, and once again, Elliott Falls he might become the GOAT in this, but we don't really care. JT Roberts, Rookie of the Year. Sixth Man of the Year was once again John Havlicek. Bickerstaff, so the 2000s is actually the best team in the league right now. Actually, West Ford is Executive of the Year. So going into the playoffs, the number 1 seed in the Western Conference is the 2000s. 2 seed is 2020, 3 seed is 2010. The 60s, the 70s, the 90s are the 3 seed, surprisingly, and the 80s are the 4 seed. Let's check the standings overall because you never know. 76 and 6, 75 and 7, 75 and 7. And the 80s went 72 and 10. Going to the Western Conference, 76 and 6, 73 and 9. And the 2010s are just, they're kind of struggling. In this league's terms, they're kind of struggling. Someone's got to knock off the 90s. I got to see someone knock off the 90s. We simulate the first round, and everyone should definitely sweep the first round. You have the 2020 versus 2010, 2000s, 60s and the 80s, the 70s and the 90s. And it looks like the 2020s have been eliminated, and the 70s have been eliminated by the 90s, the 80s have been eliminated by the 60s, and now you see the 2010s are actually starting to make a push now. It didn't look like they were, but yeah, the 60s and the 90s going up against each other. The 2010s have been eliminated by the 2000s, and the 90s just got eliminated by the 60s, which means that we have a different matchup. Kevin Garnett against Will Chamberlain. Once again, the 2000s are in it, but can they end up winning? You have Allen Iverson against Jerry West. Oh my gosh, their team is stacked. 2000s is stacked. The 60s just don't have the shooting guard. Sam Jones, you know, it is what it is. Elgin Baylor, Jerry Lucas, Will Chamberlain. You see the matchups. This could get ugly. This could get ugly, and it did not really, 6 games, but the 2000s have now won a championship. So that's 1 for the 90s, 1 for the 2000s behind Dwayne Wade as we go into the 3rd season of this simulation. All right, now we are going into our 3rd season where maybe the 60s can make the playoffs. I don't know, or not the playoffs, but the finals. But I don't know. It's looking like the 90s and the 2000s are going to be the teams. 2000 seems to be the staple coming out of the West. Obviously, it's a little bit harder to come out of the East because they have one more team. But when it comes to the eras of 2K, that's all I got for it. So I'll see you guys at the end of the regular season where maybe we can see our first repeat or we can see another new champ. And once again, at the end of our 3rd season, Elliott Falls has won a 3rd straight MVP. It is what it is. 6th Man of the Year was once again John Havlicek for the 70s. I'm kind of sensing just a little bit of a pattern here. Joel Embiid was the MIP for the 2020s, so that's big time. Maybe the 2020s are starting to peak. Zion was Clutch Player of the Year, 45 overall. And the 70s, Louis Weaver, okay. So going into the playoffs, once again, the 1 seed is the 2000s, 2020s, 2010s. They're all kind of locked in over there. The 90s are now the 1 seed. The 60s have fallen to the 3 seed. 70s are slated in at the 2 seed. And the 80s are still struggling. And they do. You have the 2000s, 2020 and the 2010s. You have the 90s and the 80s and the 70s and the 60s. So going through this one, the 80s have been eliminated by the 90s 4-1. 2010s have been eliminated by the 2020s, and the 60s have been eliminated. So now we have the 70s have reached the conference finals, and we have, once again, 2000s. So we simulate, and the 2000s just got swept, which means we will not have a back-to-back. And the 90s have also went down. So that means our last 2 champions are not in the finals, and the finals is going to be the 70s against the 2020s. Shea versus Walt Frazier, Donovan Mitchell versus Pete Maravich, Tatum versus Irving, Giannis versus Hayes, and Embiid against Kareem Abdul-Jabbar. Also, you have Luka coming off the bench for the 2020s. I think 2020s got this one here. They're finally in rhythm. Let's simulate. And they do not. In 7 games, the 70s have won behind John Havlicek, who is Finals MVP. So that has been 3 years, 3 different champions. The 70s are now on the board as we go into our 4th season of the simulation. And going into the 4th season, we have had 3 different champions. The only teams without a championship are the 60s, the 80s, the 2010s, and the 2020s. So that's 4 out of the 7 teams still haven't won. Obviously, the reason I picked 10 seasons is so there's no possibility of 14 or a couple teams tying. There is a chance that teams are going to tie. We are going to go into a sudden death 11th year. But right now, it's looking like maybe everyone gets a ring. And then it gets really into it. Obviously, we're only 3 years in. We're going to our 4th year, but it will start to heat up as we go down the backstretch. But I will see you guys at the end of the regular season. And at the end of the year, we have another New MVP, actually. Rubens Saramago, he's 68 overall. It is what it is. Sixth man of the year is now Julius Erving, so maybe John Havlicek has ended up starting for the 70s, maybe? I don't know. Defense player of the year, once again, Elliott Falls. Wemby's MIP. Julius Randle, clutch player of the year. JB Bickerstaff is now coaching the 70s, so there's that. And Nate Morgan in the 80s. So looking at it, the 2000s are the 1 seed, the 2020s are the 2 seed. It's the same story on the Western Conference. The 70s are now the 1 seed, the 80s are back to the 4, 60s are the 2, and the 90s are the 3. So we're seeing a lot of change here, but we're going to simulate to the second round where maybe we can get a repeat champion maybe, or we can get another new champion. Because right now it's looking like the 60s and the 90s and the 70s and the 80s. If both the 60s and the 80s win, we'll have a new guy coming to the finals out of the Eastern Conference. The Western Conference, 2010s have never been. 80s have been eliminated by the 70s. 2020s have been eliminated by the 2010s. And the 90s have been eliminated by the 60s. So we may have a new champion because the only two are the 2010s and the 60s. And here we go. The 60s have been eliminated. The 70s are cooking. But the 2000s have been eliminated. So the 2010s behind Steph Curry are facing the 70s behind Rick Barry. 2010s haven't won anything yet. But now they're cooking. Because you have some of the greatest scorers. You have one of the best two-ways. Melo is a good shooter. He's moved down to the power forward. Where is LeBron James? If he's a six man, it's gonna get nasty as we go and we simulate. And the 70s go back-to-back, winning another Game 7. That's the second year straight. The 70s are now in the lead with 2 rings. The 90s and the 2000s are tied with 1 ring as we go into the 5th season of this simulation. As we go into the midway point of this simulation, we're going into year 5. And man, if the 70s can pair together a couple more wins, I don't think anyone's going to be able to beat them. But the 2010s are starting to come alive. The 80s have been very lackluster. But the 90s, I thought they were going to be destroying everyone. Doesn't look like it. But at the end of the regular season, who knows what's going to happen. So I'll see you guys then. And at the end of the 5th year of our simulation, someone won an MVP. Finally, someone from a team. I'm not going to say his name, though. The rookie of the year, whatever. Michael Jordan was 6th man of the year. Why is he the 6th man? These coaches are horrible. Clutch player of the year was Damian Lillard. Not the Dame that's in the 2010s. Tyronn Lue is coach of the year. The 2010s are starting to cook. The 2010s are the 1 seed. The 2000s are starting to drop off. The 60s, the 70s, and the 80s are still the worst team out. I'd be shocked not to see the 2010s win this one. That was the best record we've seen so far. As we go into the other round, the 90s have been eliminated by the 70s. The 70s keep cooking. The 2000s have been eliminated by the 2020s. And the 80s got eliminated in Game 7. The 80s still have not gone far in the playoffs one time. Maybe I should have changed them to the 76ers. Sorry, Philly fans, I had to do it. And you have the 2010s versus 2020s, the 60s versus the 70s. 2020s have been eliminated. And the 60s have made it. So we are going to have another new champion. Carmelo Anthony, Wilt Chamberlain. 2010s versus the 60s. Chris Paul, James Harden, you've seen it. You've seen it. Jerry West, Sam Jones, Elgin Baylor, Jerry Lucas. This dogs. Left and right, Bill Russell off the bench was simulating the round. And in Game 7, the 2010s have now won. So now they're on the board. So that is 5 rings in 5 years. 4 different teams. Right now, the 70s are in the lead. But I don't know. The 2010s started off slow, but they are starting to cook. So I will see you guys at the start of year 6. Going into year 6, we only have 3 teams that have never won the title. That is the 60s, the 80s, and the 2020s. But sooner or later, the 2020s are going to start to cook. But right now, the 2010s are starting to absolutely cook people. They started off slow, but now they're coming on. I will see you at the end of this regular season where maybe the 80s can get it going, but it looks like the 80s are going to be the worst team by far. I don't know. I'll see you at the end of the regular season. And I'm not going to lie. The 2010s are starting to kind of fall a little bit. I didn't think they'd be that bad, but once again, a certain man just won the MVP. 6th man of the year is once again Michael Jordan, so maybe the 90s are going to come back and win one. Clutch player of the year is Anthony Edwards. This is not the Anthony Edwards in the 2020s. This is not. Taylor Jenkins, the 2020s is actually coach of the year, so maybe the 2020s are going to start cooking. The 70s against the 80s, the 60s against the 90s, the 2010s against the 2000s, and the 2020s are the number 1 seed. But will they be able to do it? Can they pull it out? The 80s have once again not gotten past the second round. The 60s have been eliminated. The 2000s have been eliminated. There is a very good chance that we are going to see a champion here. A repeat champion, unless the 2020s can win, and they do not. So we are going to have either a repeat champion or the 90s are going to come back and claim the crown. You have the 2010s versus the 90s. You have LeBron versus Jordan in the title game. Year 6, it's starting to heat up. Whoever wins this ties the 70s and is now also in the lead. I like the 90s here. I think that Hakeem is going to go crazy. And they win in 7 behind MJ. And that makes it 2 rings for the 90s, 1 ring for the 2010s, 2 rings for the 70s, and 1 for the 2000s as we go into year 7. Can the bad man get 3 straight MVPs? Can someone from the 90s or the 70s take the lead? Or will we see another new champion? Will we see the 2010s catch up? Will we see the 2000s catch up? There are so many things that are starting to come into play down the stretch that, hey, this is starting to look like it's a good experiment. But all that will be answered at the end of the regular season. So I will see you then. And going into the end of the regular season of year 7, Elgin Baylor now won an MVP. So the 60s, they don't have a ring yet. The 60s don't have a ring. 2020s don't have a ring. In the 80s, not sure they'll get a ring. Julius Erving was the 6th man of the year. The coach of the year was Taylor Jenkins. The 2020s just went 78-4. So this is make or break for him because we have 4 years left. We have the 7th, 8th, the 9th, and the 10th year. 4 rings left to get. 2020s are down 2. The 80s are down 2. The 60s are down 2. So you need to start doing something now if you want to win. And it's really looking like the 60s are trying their best. Because look at the points. Look at the points. You guys know it. You guys know the stuff. The 60s are now the 2nd seed, so maybe they're getting back into it. Simulating round 1, obviously everyone's going to sweep. But now you have the 2000s and the 2010s. You have the 90s. If the 90s get another ring, the 60s have been eliminated, and the 80s have finally made it into the conference championship. The 2000s have been eliminated, and the 90s have been eliminated. So the 70s, they can get a leg up. The 80s can start making it. The 2020s can get a ring. So there's a possibility we get a new champion here. And we do not from the 80s, but the 2020s are back in against the 70s. The 70s are looking to get another ring to put them in the lead. They're stacked, but you just look at the 2020s. I mean, I just don't see the 2020s losing. I just don't. And they do. They choke a 3-1 lead. The 70s come back and they have taken the lead. That is their 3rd ring. That is their 3rd ring. An insane choke from the 2020s. And now it's going to be between any team with a ring unless 2020s can win 3 straight, which I'm not saying they won't, but it doesn't look that good. So we are going to see what's going to happen as we go into the 8th season of this simulation. So going into year 8, this is starting to be must-win territory for some teams. The 70s have 3 rings. The 90s have 2 rings. The 2000s have 1 ring. And the 2010s have 1 ring as well. So in order to win, we're going to need to see some team make a run, or it's going to be between the 70s and the 90s. But that last win for the 70s was big time. But we will see what happens at the end of this year's regular season as we go into year 8. And at the end of regular season number 8, Elgin Baylor has won another MVP. Maybe the 60s are going to make a last-second push. Bernard was Rookie of the Year. Jordan was 6th Man of the Year. The 90s need to get even. Scotty was DPOY. It kind of feels like these guys know what needs to happen. Anthony Edwards was Clutch Player of the Year. Sam Cassell was Coach of the Year. He's back in Boston. He's actually an assistant coach there right now. So Boston's messing around a little bit, which means that the 60s are really, really going after it. As you guys see, man, 2020s were just 2 games away. If they just won both of those Game 7s, they would be in the race as well. But now you're looking at it, and I don't know, man. I just don't know. Simulating the semis, the 80s have been eliminated, and the 90s have been eliminated, which means that if the 70s can win here, they will pretty much wrap this thing up as the 60s beat the 70s and go to the finals, and we are going to have a new champion. Luka, Bob Cousy, the oldest generation versus the youngest generation. My generation versus the oldest generation. I'm not in the 60s. Stop saying that. And the 60s have won. And maybe they make a run for it because they've been getting better and better each year. The 60s now have a ring underneath their belt. We have 2 seasons left. Right now, the 70s are looking like they're going to win. But you never know. Crazier things have happened. So I will see you guys at the start of year 9. Going into this year, we now have 2 teams eliminated. Those teams are the 2020s and the 80s. And the heartbreaking thing about that, as you see the 60s absolutely destroying people, is that the 2020s just went to 3 straight finals and lost every single one. So it is what it is. I'll see you guys at the end of the regular season. At the end of this year, Rick Barry is the MVP, which means that the 70s with Julius Erving as well, are looking to put the nail in the coffin. Because if they win it this year, that's it. It's over. LeBron was DPOY. He's been pretty quiet. But look at the 60s, man. Look at the 60s. The 2010s are the leader there. They could win 2 straight. The only teams that are eliminated are the 80s and the 2020s. Those are the only teams that you can't see win as we go into the conference semis. The 2020s have been eliminated. The 80s have been eliminated. And the 90s have been eliminated. So the 90s it's not looking good. 2010s and 2000. But now, with the opportunity to put this thing away, the 70s can do it with a win here. And it's 3-2. And they don't. And they don't. The 60s and the 2010s are going to be in here. And the 60s have gone back-to-back. That is 2 straight. That means that they are 1 away. Going into the final season of this sim, the 70s have 3, the 60s have 2, the 90s have 2, the 10s and the 2000s each have 1, and we are going into year 10 of this simulation where it's going to see, will the 60s or the 90s be able to force sudden death, or will it be too late and the 70s will win? I guess we'll find out. And going into year 10, the only 3 teams that are in it now are the 60s, the 90s, and the 70s. 2 teams haven't won a ring, that's 2020s and the 80s. And right now, the 70s have 3 rings while the 60s and the 90s have 2. But the 60s are on an absolute roll. Who knows, man? If the 60s or the 90s win, it's going to a sudden death year. But I don't know, man. Can the 70s close it out? Will the 60s come back? Because at the end of the time, it's going to be between the first 2 of them to win a ring. But I don't know. A lot of things can happen in a season. I'll see you guys at the end of this one's regular season. And at the end of the final regular season, Carmelo Anthony from the 2010s has won an MVP. 6th man of the year was Jordan with the 90s. So either him or someone from the 60s has to win. Defensive player of the year is LeBron James. Are the 2010s just going to be a little bit too late? Daignault for the Bulls. He came from the Thunder. And the 1 seed is the Bulls. The 2 seed is the 70s. The 60s have fallen to the 3 seed, which means that they will play them in the conference semis. Oh man, I don't know. I don't know if the 60s are going to come up short or what's going to happen. Everybody that needs to win's on one side of the bracket. And the 60s beat the 70s and it's open. It's open. But the 80s beat the 90s. So it has come down to the 60s. The 60s are the only way that this thing can go to a sudden death simulation. And they make the finals. And the 2010s got beat as well. The 60s against the stacked 2000 squad. You got Kobe, Kevin Garnett, Tim Duncan. You have all these guys. And they force a sudden death simulation with their 3rd straight championship. They came out of nowhere to win 3 straight, and we are going to a sudden death. So the first team between the 60s or the 70s to win a ring will end up being crowned as the best era of all time. So let's get into our sudden death season where maybe the 60s, maybe the 70s win, but who knows? All right, as we enter the sudden death, it's going to come down to whoever wins the ring first. The 60s have a chance to pull off the biggest upset in this channel's history so far. Now the channel's been around for 2 months. But would be huge, but I don't know, man. There's a lot of stuff that can happen. So I'll see you guys at the end of the regular season and see if maybe the 60s can come all the way back, winning the last 4 seasons to become the greatest era of all time. Comeback story. Who doesn't love it? And at the end of the year, Rick Barry has won with the 70s. Julius Erving, 6th man of the year. Scottie Pippen, you know, maybe they're trying to come back. The 60s, they're the 3 seed. 70s are the 2 seed. They're going to be facing off. And they're going to be in the semis against each other. And the 70s have won. And it's the 90s against them. And they have made the finals. The 70s have a chance to take it against the 2020 team. Rick Barry is balling. And it is all up to this. We'll go by games now. In game 1, the 70s lose. Game 2, the 70s lose. Game 3, the 70s lose. In game 4, the 70s win. Game 5, the 70s win. Game 6, the 70s win. In game 7, they come back from down 3-0 in a sudden death. Dude, this is not scripted. You couldn't script a better ending than this. When everyone thought it was lost, they were down 3-0. The 70s come back against the 2020s, who was the hottest team in the league that year, and wins it. All I gotta say now is that the 70s, whose team is Kareem, Julius Erving, Rick Barry, Pete Maravich, Walt Frazier, John Havlicek, Bob McAdoo, Wes Unseld, Bill Walton, Dave Cowens, Elvin Hayes, that is the best era in NBA history, according to 2K24. But hey, man, that was crazy. As always, thank you guys for watching. I know a lot of you people who have watched aren't liked or subscribed, but if you guys made it this far into the video, it's a long video. I appreciate it. Drop a like and a sub. It helps out the channel. It helps me out a lot. I appreciate all the support recently. We recently just hit 4,000 subs. We also recently just had our first video get over 20,000 views. I work really hard on it, and I'm really glad that you guys are supporting me. Other than that, that's all I have for you guys today. Have a great day or night whenever you're watching this. And the most important thing I can stress to you is come here. God bless. Jesus loves you. Have a great day. Peace.